And to continue, the sphenoid sinus or sphenoidal sinus is a cavity opening within the sphenoid, and just like with the frontal sinus, it is continuous with the nasal passages. And then the optic canal is actually not so visible in this view, but it's actually here and here. If you can imagine the optic nerve going through there. We'll look at it on another view. Here we go. So here's a superior view looking into the cranium, and in red here is the sphenoid bone. Very highly irregular and spans from the right to the left side of the skull or cranium. And superior view from above, same thing here. And here would be the optic canal going through here and out towards the front to the back of the orbit. So you kind of see a little dark spot here going through. And the sella turcica here in the sphenoid is this depression right here in the sphenoid. So this is a mid-sagittal view, and that's where the pituitary gland of the brain sits, right in that little depression, sella turcica. Okay, let's move on to the ethmoid bone, which is here in yellow. And you can only see a small part of the ethmoid from the superior view. This is an anterior view, so looking from the front of the cranium, like looking into someone's face. This little ridge crest is called the crista galli. That's this little bony protrusion there. So it does form part of the orbit wall a little bit in this area. A roof of the nasal cavity, so this would be the nasal passages here. This is part of the bony nasal septum, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. It has what's called the cribriform plate that has little openings called foramina, and that's this structure here with these little holes. So what happens here is in this little depression or groove sits part of the olfactory nerve for smelling, and nerves from the olfactory nerve, the olfactory bulb here, go through these little openings, these foramina, and then innervate the nasal epithelium in this part of the ethmoid bone. So this would be in the nasal passages, and then odorant molecules that you breathe in would land on the epithelium here, on the skin here, and then picked up by those endings of those neurons, and then transmitting through the olfactory bulb into the brain for olfaction or smelling. You can kind of get a little hint of the little dark spots here, which are these foramina in the cribriform plate. So I kind of refer to this sometimes as the top of a salt shaker, the cribriform plate, and the little holes in the salt shaker are the little openings called the foramina. And then there's that little ridge called the crista galli. And then, excuse me, part of the ethmoid bone forms or has what are called the superior nasal conchae, which are these structures here, and they're covered with epithelium in the nasal passages, and then also the middle nasal conchae. So they're covered also with skin, epithelium, and when you breathe in, the air swirls around those conchae, and eventually goes back to the back of the nasal passages, down the esophagus a little bit, and then down your windpipe, trachea. So very irregular shaped bone, the ethmoid. Oh, and there's that perpendicular plate, the bony portion of your nasal septum that divides the two nasal passages, your right and left nasal passages. Oh, and then internally, it's hard to see, there's also a sinus in there called the ethmoid sinus. That's also, again, continuous with the nasal passages. Okay, oh, more views of the ethmoid bone, highly irregular bone. Okay, let's move on to the vomer. So that is seen here, right here in the diagram. And it also forms part of the nasal septum. This superior part here is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. There's that little ridge, the crista galli. There's the sphenoid with its sella turcica. And then the vomer is this one bone that you can only see in a mid-sagittal section in the brain. Here it is in green. There's the sphenoid. There's the ethmoid with its perpendicular plate. And that's what the pencil is pointing at right there, the vomer. Okay, let's move on to the maxilla. You have your left and right maxilla forming the upper jaw. It has a little opening called the infraorbital foramen below the eye. That's for innervation of the skin on that portion of the face, right there. It has a structure called the palatine process. So this is looking at, excuse me, this right maxilla, but from the midline. So looking at it from the left side. So that tooth is this tooth, and these molars back here would be these molars. So this would be internally the roof of the mouth, the hard palate, and the hard palate is formed by this part of the maxilla, and it extends back to form what's called the palatine process. And it articulates, it meets the palatine bone, which is internal, again forming the hard palate within the roof of the oral cavity. And then within the maxilla, right about here, there's spaces inside called the maxillary sinus. And that, again, with the other sinuses, is continuous with the nasal passages. Here's a bit of the maxillary sinus there. So this is looking at the hard palate, the palatine process of the maxilla. So here's the upper teeth. So this is looking from above, looking down at the section here, right, transverse section. So in yellow here, this is actually the palatine bone. It's horizontal plate, which actually combines with the palatine process of the maxilla to form the roof of the mouth, the hard palate. And palatine bone, it's a small L-shaped bone. So we have two of them. That's the midline there. So this little ridge here would be this ridge here. This portion here that's flat are these portions here, and then these go up towards the orbits. So a very unusually shaped bone, forms part of the orbit and part of the hard palate. You see in our little diagram here as it spins around where it's located very deep in the facial bones. Again, there it is here in yellow and here in orange. Palatine bone, two of them, palatine bones. The nasal bones, right here, anterior, above the nasal passages, so that forms the hard part of the nose, the bridge of the nose. Like your pads on your eyeglasses would sit right on that nasal bone. And it supports the cartilaginous, flexible part of our nose. The lacrimal bones, smallest skull bones, if we ignore the ossicles, the bones for hearing, and that's here in red, you can see it right here, has a little shallow groove called the lacrimal groove for part of the what's called the lacrimal apparatus that we'll deal with later when we do vision, and a small part of that medial portion of each orbit. Here in yellow, you see a tiny bit of the palatine bone that's way deep internal. Here in purple, there's part of that sphenoid bone. And then in green, there's part of that ethmoid bone, and there's part of the nasal conchae of the ethmoid bone in green. And finally down to the lower jaw, mandible. With our teeth, lower teeth, it does have a process called the coronoid process here. And that's for attachment of muscles so that you can close your jaw and chew. Then posterior to that is the condylar process here and there. And the condylar process articulates with the temporal bone, because the temporal bone has what's called the mandibular fossa, which sits right over the condylar process, the head of the condylar process. Mental foramen, right down here, little opening, a foramen. That's for nerves, innervation of this portion of the jaw. And you see here there how the condylar process, its head articulates with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. And let's move on to the zygomatic bones here. Forms part of the zygomatic arch, part of your cheekbone. Articulates with the maxilla, ethmoid, sphenoid, and the lateral part, forms the lateral part of the orbit. Also articulates with the temporal bone with what's called the temporal process. Just the way the temporal bone has the zygomatic process. There you go, forming the zygomatic arch, comprised of those two processes of the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone there. Okay, the hyoid bone is an interesting bone associated with the head or skull. It sits inferior to below the mandible and a bit posterior, and it's this kind of horn-shaped bone. And interestingly, it does not physically contact other bones. It doesn't articulate with other bones. It's just held in place by these muscles and ligaments, helping to support the larynx or the voice box right back there. So it does not articulate with any other bone and helps support the larynx and then even the tongue to a certain degree. Right about there. So the tongue would be here, and the larynx and voice box right down here. So when you swallow your Adam's apple, this portion of the thyroid cartilage of your larynx or voice box moves up and drops down. That's because these muscles contract and lift up the hyoid bone, and that helps lift up the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. And finally, fontanelles, fibrous connective tissue soft spots on the skulls of newborns, fetuses. So this connective tissue has not been fully ossified or converted into solid bone, and that allows for compression of the skull during birth, so I can go through the birth canal, and then for rapid growth of the brain after birth. And it's not until about 2 years of age that all of the fontanelles fully ossify and become solid bone. And then the only ones I really want you to know is this anterior one and the posterior one, which we really can't even see here. Oh, here we go. Posterior fontanelle. Okay, so anterior one here and the posterior one is back here. There's the anterior one, very large and obvious. Okay, let's move on to the vertebral column. All right, the vertebra. Encloses and protects the spinal cord and articulates and supports the head, and also is a site of attachment for the hips, the hip bones, I mean, and of course the ribs. So it consists of 7 cervical vertebrae. If you remember, the cervicus or cervical refers to the neck. There's 7 of them. And they are different from the 12 thoracic vertebrae in the thorax, in part because the 12 thoracic vertebrae are attached to your 12 pairs of ribs, and your cervical vertebrae are not attached to ribs. And then inferior to that, as the vertebral column descends, the bones get bigger and heavier because they're supporting more weight as you go further down inferiorly. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae, L1 through L5. And then we have 1 sacrum, which is actually formed from fused sacral vertebrae. And at the very inferior end, we have the coccyx, which is formed from fused coccygeal vertebrae, our tailbone. So that's the vertebral column. I tell students one way to remember the numbers is 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. You have early breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, early supper at 5. That might help. Okay. And then between the vertebrae are the intervertebral discs that act as nice cushioning shock absorbers. They're made of elastic tissue and that tough fibrocartilage connective tissue. Okay, let's look at a typical vertebrae, even though there's a